Well, first of all, I want to say what a pleasure it is to be doing this. It's wonderful to see Chetan again. But I have to tell you, it's 9:30 at night here, not my prime time. I'm on the East Coast of the United States, but I'm very glad to be able to participate in your class. I wish I could see more of you rather than just your initials, because it's really hard to teach a class when you don't see anybody. Oh, thank you for turning on your camera. And I hope that afterwards we'll have a little bit of a chance to talk. As Chetan has told you, my field is Japanese art history, design, and material culture. And what I want to do today is perhaps a little different than what you expected. But what I want to do is look with you at a set of rather disparate objects, objects that you might see when visiting a museum, visiting the Japanese galleries in a museum. And what I want to do is think with you about them from the perspective of the environmental benefits of space saving. The objects we're going to look at are three, and very simple ones. We're going to look at a pair of folding screens, at a folding fan, and at a kimono. Now, these are obviously very different in form and function, but I see them as belonging to a shared ecology because all relate to their environment through folding. And I am, as I may be understanding the word object ecologies a little bit differently than you are, but my sense is that an object ecologies involve objects that relate to the environment in different ways. But here I'm seeing them as a group because they all relate to their environment through folding. First, a few words of introduction. Why think about this? Well, climate disruption increasingly affects every human activity, and we need to try to address it in any way that we can. Reducing consumption and reducing our environmental footprint are but two of many ways that we do that. And I think that as industrial designers, you'll have a huge role to play in this process. And folding is something that might be helpful or useful to you in the future, because things that take up less space are more environmentally sustainable with respect to material resources and energy. Now, it would seem intuitive that folding, which makes it possible for an object to occupy a much smaller space than it might otherwise do, would have nothing but advantages because it represents a kind of downsizing. But might the possibility of folding also have disadvantages? These are two questions that I'd like you to keep in the back of your mind as I talk today, and we can come back to them afterwards and talk about the pros and cons of folding. But let's begin, and if we could have the first slide, Chetan, please. Thank you. Let's begin by considering the various meanings of the fold. To get us started, I put on the screen here a screen cut from a dictionary definition. As a verb, the word to fold means to bend, something flexible and relatively flat over on itself so that one part of it covers another. It can also mean to cover or wrap something. And it can also refer to the shape produced by the gentle draping of a loose full garment or a piece of cloth. The word fold can be used in a lot of different contexts, and I've just put three up here on the screen. For example, in cooking, when you want to gently introduce some ingredients into a batter, you talk about folding them into the batter, as the person here does egg whites. The word fold also crops up in geology, where people talk about the folds in sediment that has been forced upward by geological forces. And if you look at this picture, you can see the many different undulating, multicolored folds of the earth here. But perhaps the most common context in which we think about folds is in clothing, as in a skirt, where you see here folds that are undulating. The pleat, of course, is a kind of tight fold. Folds are very, very common in European and European clothing, but less so in the context of Japan. Next slide, please. So let's turn to my three objects: screens, fans, and kimono. The first object we're going to look at is the folding screen that's known as byobu in Japanese, which literally means wind wall. Then I want to look at fans, ogi or sensu in Japanese. And then I want to look at kimono, which literally means thing to wear. Now, as you look at the three images on the screen, you can see very clearly that these are very, very different objects made of different materials, of different sizes. But besides the fact that they can be folded, one thing that they have in common was that in pre-modern Japan, they were all part of daily life. That is no longer the case. But they can still be found in some Japanese households. Well, let's begin with screens. And if we can have the next slide, please. Thanks. There are many kinds of screens that have been traditionally used in Japan. Probably most of you are familiar with shoji screens, which are screens that are made of translucent paper and are built in to Japanese homes even today. On the left, you see a shoji screen, which has been open, making the inside and the outside blur together. But the kind of screen that we're going to be looking at for the next few minutes is the screen that you see on the right, actually a pair of screen, and they are set up in a museum. There are many different kinds of folding screens in Japan. They come in different sizes, different numbers of panels, but the most common are six-fold screens. By that I mean each screen has 6 panels with a total here of 12. Now, the most typical size of a folding screen, like the one that you see here, is about 1.5 meters high, and when stretched out, about 3.5 meters in length. Screens are made sort of like the ones that you see, the shoji that you see on the left. Inside of these screens is a wooden lattice over which layers of paper have been applied. And the hinges that make it possible for the screen to bend forward or back are made from overlapping pieces of paper. Screens are theoretically portable. They can be moved from one room to another. But in actual fact, a screen that is 1.5 meters high and 6 panels is very heavy. So you have to move them carefully. I mean, I have lifted one, I have lifted them and moved them around, but it's not easy at all. But what's important to my point here is that when screens are not in use, they can be folded and stored away. And when they're folded, they are the size of a single panel. Now, what kind of function do these screens, what kind of function do byobus have? Well, because they're portable, they can be used to break up space, to divide rooms, to make a large room smaller, or to make an area more private. And let's see if we can have the next slide, please. In the past, they were even used as supports for clothing. When someone disrobed, they might just toss their garment over the screen, as you see on the left-hand side here. That's a kimono hanging from the screen. As you see from the screens, within screens in these pictures, screens can be folded in many ways, thanks to the hinges, the paper hinges. And you can also see that they are very commonly painted. They can be painted with scenes of human activities. They can be painted with animals. They can be painted with landscapes. They can also be a support for famous sayings or poems done in a fine calligraphic style. But what's important about the function of screens is that they can serve in interior space both to break up the space and to decorate the space. And decorate the space in different ways according to different times of the year. For example, at one time of the year, you might want to have, at springtime, let's say, you might want to have a screen that has spring flowers, whereas in winter, you might want to have a winter scene. In terms of the manufacture of screen, I've mentioned that screens are made from wooden lattices covered with paper, which means that all of the materials used in the manufacture of screens are basically biodegradable, although screens sometimes have metal features. Let's turn to the second example. Next slide, please. So here's another kind of foldable article, fans. Like folding screens, folding fans have a long history in Japan, going back to the 8th century at least. They were probably introduced from China, where, as in Japan, they fulfilled a similar function, that is, to create a breeze during a hot summer day. But many different kinds of fans were used in Japan. There are flat, round paper fans known as uchiwa, an example of which you see on the left, which have a bamboo handle and ribs also made of bamboo. Then there are folding fans, which may be made of paper or silk and can be painted. You see an example of that in the center. And since ancient times, there have been folding fans made of slips of bamboo or of slips of wood, which again can be painted. And the fan that you see open on the right-hand side, believe it or not, is from the 12th century and has been painted with a scene of courtiers. As you also can see from the slide on the right and the one in the middle, one of the key features of the folding fan is that all of the ribs are held together with a rivet, which allows the bamboo ribs to pivot open and to be closed. One of the advantages, next slide, please. One of the advantages of the folding fan is that it can be made very compact. You see on the left-hand side, it's not much more than a pencil or a pen. And that means that it could be easily carried in the sleeve of a kimono, which has a kind of pocket-like extension where you can carry light objects. So if you wanted to carry a fan unseen, you could just slip it into your sleeve. This is different from the paper unfolding fan, the round one, which you either have to carry in your hand or you could tuck in the back of in the sash of your kimono. In traditional Japan, I learned in preparing for this class, there's actually a special way of opening a fan, and there are particular moments for opening and using a fan. Uses that go beyond its basic function of providing a source of cooling on a hot summer day. Fans can be used to cover the face if you want to be modest. This was particularly for women. They can be used for writing autographs. It was not uncommon, and even today I've had this happen, where someone will present you a fan and ask you to sign it and say and write something nice about the occasion. Next, please. Fans can also be used for advertisement, and this is particularly common for the flat paper fans. In the summer, when there are festivals, free fans are often distributed by companies because they're advertising their wares, as the fan in the center is here. Fans are also used for dancing, for various kinds of performances, but just straight dance performances or in no and kabuki. The woman that you see on the right is using a fan for a traditional dance. Fans were also used to notify troops for the start of a battle. A fan would be raised. The fan, like the one that you see on the left-hand side here, would be painted in bright colors with a striking motif so that the troop could immediately see them. Here you see a fan that's been painted in black, lacquer black, with a red sun so that it would be readily visible to troops when held up. Fans can even be used to when outstretched, if you are at a gathering of some sort, if you want to receive a light refreshment, a cookie or a candy or something, you can hold your outstretched fan and someone will put that on your fan. So fans have many, many different functions besides what you would assume to be their primary function. Making fans, next slide, please. Making fans is actually quite complex and involves the collaboration of many different craftspeople. First of all, the bamboo ribs have to be cut. And in the slide on the left here, you see the bamboo ribs, which all have to be of absolutely equal size. They have to be very carefully cut and without breaking them, obviously, but they also have to be pierced with a small hole at the end where the rivet would be placed. Then the fan part has to be made from a flat, actually from two flat sheets of paper, which are cut into fan shape and then placed in molds and dampened so that they assume the zigzag shape that you see in the center. Then the two pieces of paper are glued together and the ribs are inserted. And then lastly, they have to be held together with a rivet that will allow the fan to open up and to close easily. When one thinks of traditional crafts in Japan, one thinks, next please, one thinks primarily of craftsmen. But in fact, craft making was very often an activity carried out predominantly by women. It's thought that that women might have been brought in to make them because of their manual dexterity. What you see here is an 18th century woodblock printed book showing women. It is rather idealized. The women are rather beautifully dressed, but it's rather idealized in that respect. But it in fact shows the way that fans were actually made. To your right, you see a woman who is holding open a painted fan, one that she has just folded. And as you can see, it's a black fan with a red sun motif, like the one that we just saw, that might be used for decorative purposes or for a warrior. And beside her, there are other fans that she has just folded, and resting on top of them is a ruler that she has used to make sure that all of the pleats are even. The big box behind her, which is fan shape, holds plain fans, unfolded fans, which have been painted, which she will later take out one by one to work with. The woman on the other side of her is holding a finished fan into which she has just inserted the ribs. And you can see next to her another set of ribs, as well as a brush that she would use for the glue to put together the front and the back of the fan. So as you can see, it's a fairly complex process. So fans were not inexpensive, particularly when they were painted. Next, please. So let's turn now to my third and final example, the kimono. What we know is a kimono originated as a form of undergarment, which in the 16th century became basically the overgarment, the the principal mode of dress for both men and women of all classes. The kimono is basically a T-shaped garment. As you can see in the diagram on the right and on the left-hand side, the garment that's hanging from a rack. It's not entirely T-shaped because the front of it has been flipped open, so you can see the continuity of the motif. But it is basically T-shaped, and it's open in the front, and it had sleeves of varying lengths. The length of the sleeve for an unmarried woman was very long, and for a married woman, somewhat shorter, and for men, still shorter. The kimono is worn with a sash of varying widths, depending on fashion. One can often date woodblock prints like the one in the middle by the way in which the sash or obi is tied, because we know decade by decade the fashions in sashes. The woman standing holding the altar, the portable altar, has her kimono tied with a very large, wide sash with a long hanging bow in the back. In the foreground, the man wearing a striped kimono just has a very narrow sash tied in the back. Men did not wear the same fancy sashes that women did. There are no buttons or snaps or other appurtenances to hold the garment in place. Just the obi holds it closed. So it's folded over the body very tightly, and then the obi is wrapped around to keep it in place. The kimono is very economical in terms of resource use. Next, please. Certainly in comparison, let's say in the 19th century, with 19th century Western dress. On the right, you have an image of the kind of dress that would have been worn in Victorian Europe about the same time that the woman on the left, the print of the woman on the left was created. And you can see that the robe on the right has a bustle, has lots of extra fabric to enhance the size of the woman. On the other hand, the kimono fits very closely to the body. And although there is a considerable amount of fabric, it's not nearly as extensive as for Western Victorian dress. The kimono, as I said, is made without any wasted fabric. Fabric in pre-modern Japan was woven to a loom size of about 35 centimeters, and then it could be any length. But the kimono is made from strips of fabric that are each 35 centimeters in length, in width. So if you look at the bottom part of the diagram on the right, you can see that parts A, B, and C, which form the front and the back panels of the main body of the kimono, are all the same width. There's no selvage. They are the full width of the fabric. And that the sleeves are also the full width. So there's no waste there. And the only other parts that have to be cut into smaller pieces are on the far right, E, D, and F, which are the different parts of the collar. So this is, again, to reiterate, a very economical use of fabric. What about the materials from which kimono are made? Next, please. So kimono can be made of a lot of different materials. They can be made of cotton, they can be made of silk, they can be made of a blend of the two, or they can be made of other bast fibers. In early modern Japan, theoretically, only the samurai class was allowed to wear kimono made of silk. Farmers and other commoners were supposed to only wear cotton. But in fact, people got around that quite easily. But there's no question that economic circumstances dictated whether you wore a cotton or a silk kimono. Silk obviously was much more expensive. But cotton and silk were both extremely important to the local economies in early modern Japan throughout the country. At the time, I don't think the environmental and ethical considerations of these two fabrics were taken into account. But today, whatever material we use, we must think about these things. And of course, as you are surely aware, cotton cultivation is one of the most environmentally unfriendly crops in the world because it consumes so much water, and it also requires great quantities of fertilization. So it's a crop that that is heavily criticized in many parts of the world for that reason. Silk production is extremely time consuming, but it also raises ethical considerations. Why? Because to get silk, you have to kill the larvae and extract the silk from their cocoons. So, so both of these materials are the object of a lot of environmental criticism today. Well, you're probably wondering why I have included the kimono among the ecology of objects that bring folding into play. Well, one could argue that the kimono enfolds the body, but it doesn't, without showing the kinds of pleats that we saw in the skirt that I showed you at the very beginning, or that we find in many forms of Western clothing. But folding comes into play in the case of the kimono most significantly when it is stored, when it's put away. Because kimono are not put away by hanging in the closet. They are folded into a small, compact package. Can I have the next ones, please? Well, folding a kimono is a big deal. And these pictures give you just some idea of that. If you look on YouTube, you will find all sorts of guides to folding a kimono because many young women today don't know how to do it and they have to take lessons. And it is extremely complicated. I'm only showing you a few slides here. Um, the the directions that I'm showing you on the left here are part of a set of 30 pictures showing you step by step how to fold a kimono. The basic principles are not that difficult, but the process is complex and it does take a while to learn how to do it. The basic principle is that you follow the seams of the garment. And you begin by folding the kimono in half lengthwise, folding one sleeve over the body, as you see in the center bottom here. And next, please, next slides. And then you fold the lower length of the kimono over the upper length to the length of the sleeve, and then you fold the sleeve over the whole. So the result of this is that you get a package folded onto itself, which is basically the length of the sleeve. So that the kimono can be put away in a drawer, and many kimono can be piled up on top of one another. Now, I think that there are clear disadvantages to the fold here, while the other examples that I gave you suggest the advantages, the space-saving advantages of the fold, the portability of the fold. Here, we see that to fold a garment like the kimono requires time. I would say it probably, unless you're really good at this, it's taken me at least 5 or 10 minutes to do it because I'm not very good at it. It takes energy, and it takes cognitive skills. This is not something that you can do automatically. You have to learn how to fold a garment. Simply hanging a garment in the closet is obviously much, much easier. Okay, so what have we got here? We've looked at 3 different objects that have been part of Japanese life and culture for centuries. Objects that the finest examples of which you can see in a museum today, but examples of which you might also see in a Japanese home. Although each is very different, they're very different from one another in both form and function, I've suggested that we can talk about them as an ecology of objects because they all relate to the environment in a similar way, a way that involves bending and covering, a way that brings into play their flexibility, a way that makes them portable, a way that makes them space-saving. And even though we've been looking at objects that are not necessarily very familiar to you, or that probably don't have much meaning to you, to your or my life today, I think that by looking at these unfamiliar objects from a familiar vantage point, that is the fold, can open up a very productive discussion about contemporary object ecologies that make use of folding, object ecologies and the materials from which they're made, and their relationship to the environment. What I'd like to do now to wrap up our discussion is to pose some questions for you to think about, or for us to think about together.